Imagine this. You are a young woman named Xochitl from the city of Tlatelolco, barely 16 years old, standing barefoot on cold stone floors in the year 1519. The air is thick with copal incense that burns your throat with each shallow breath. Distant drums echo through corridors you've never seen before, their rhythm matching the terrified pounding of your heart. Your hands tremble as palace guards lead you deeper into Emperor Moctezuma's private complex, past chambers where other young women wait with hollow eyes. What you're about to discover goes far beyond any religious ceremony your mother warned you about. This isn't about honoring the gods. This is about something far more twisted and horrifying than anything the history books will ever tell you. Think the Aztec Empire was all about magnificent pyramids and sophisticated culture? Think again. While historians celebrate Tenochtitlan's architectural marvels, they conveniently skip over one of the most disturbing institutions in Mesoamerican history. The palace complex of Emperor Moctezuma II housed more than 3,000 women, and their presence wasn't about domestic service. These women existed in a carefully organized system of exploitation that made modern power abuse scandals look restrained. Documents written by Spanish conquistadors who witnessed the palace firsthand describe scenes that shocked even men who'd participated in brutal conquests. What you're about to learn shatters the romanticized vision of pre-Columbian civilization that we've been fed for generations. The Aztec concept of divine kingship meant that Moctezuma wasn't just a political ruler. He was considered the living representative of Huitzilopochtli, the sun god himself. This merger of religious and political authority gave the emperor absolute power over every aspect of his subjects' lives. The palace at Tenochtitlan was a sprawling complex, covering several city blocks, with separate compounds designed for different categories of women. Spanish chronicler Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who entered these spaces in 1519, described a labyrinth of chambers surrounding courtyards where hundreds of women lived under constant surveillance. The legal framework was brutally simple. Conquered territories paid tribute to Tenochtitlan not just in gold, but in their daughters. Families from Texcoco and dozens of other subject cities were required to send their most beautiful young women to the capital. Religious justification wrapped around every aspect of the system. Fertility rituals tied to agricultural cycles supposedly required the emperor's participation with multiple women. Resistance wasn't just disobedience, it was heresy that threatened the entire universe. The selection process began when tribute collectors arrived in subject cities with specific requirements. They wanted girls between 13 and 17 years old, physically unblemished, and preferably virginal. Families had no choice. Refusing meant severe punishment for the entire household, often including execution of male family members. The girls traveled to Tenochtitlan in groups, walking for weeks. Upon arrival, they faced degrading examinations. Bernardino de Sahagun's Florentine Codex, compiled between 1545 and 1590 from interviews with Aztec survivors, describes how palace officials inspected each girl's body with clinical detachment. They checked for scars and disease. They verified virginity through invasive examination. They categorized girls by appearance, assigning them to different ranks before the girls understood what was happening. One documented case describes a 15-year-old girl from Texcoco whose selection was recorded in detail. She arrived in 1517. Officials noted her height, her face, her hair. They classified her as suitable for ceremonial service, which sealed her fate. She was taken to training compounds where new arrivals learned what sacred duties actually meant. Older women who'd survived years in the system taught the newcomers how to behave, how to endure what was coming. These weren't kind mentors. They were enforcers of a system that had broken them, passing their trauma forward because cooperation meant survival and resistance meant disappearance. The palace hierarchy was precisely organized. At the highest level were official wives from noble families. Below them were ceremonial attendants, most tribute girls. These women participated in monthly rituals and were available for the emperor's private chambers. Lower still were domestic servants. At the bottom were expendables, girls whose resistance made them unsuitable. What happened to them wasn't recorded, but Spanish observers noted that the palace constantly required replenishment, despite no evidence of women leaving through legitimate channels. Escape was virtually impossible. High walls surrounded the compounds. Armed guards patrolled corridors. But the most effective barrier was social shame. If a tribute daughter fled and returned home, she brought disgrace to her entire lineage. She'd violated sacred duty, insulted the emperor, endangered her city's standing. Most families would refuse to take her back. A few desperate girls tried. Diego Duran's History of the Indies of New Spain, written in 1581, mentions a girl who attempted escape in 1515 by hiding in a merchant's canoe. Guards discovered her before the boat reached the causeway. She was dragged back and never seen again. Duran's indigenous informants told this story decades later, still whispering about what happened as a warning. But here's where it becomes truly disturbing. The selection and imprisonment were only the beginning. The monthly ceremonies followed the Aztec agricultural calendar with terrifying precision. Each veintina included rituals tied to specific deities. The ceremony of Ochpanisli in September required what priests called sacred union between the emperor and multiple young women representing the earth goddess Tosi. Preparation began days in advance. Selected women were isolated in special chambers where they fasted, consuming only minimal maize, gruel, and water. Ritual bathing purified their bodies. Then came the substances. Palace priests administered teonanacatl, sacred mushrooms, and ololiuki, morning glory seeds mixed with pulque. These hallucinogens weren't optional. Women who refused were held down while priests forced the mixtures down their throats. The ceremonial chambers were designed specifically for these rituals, decorated with murals depicting explicit acts between deities. The Codex Mendoza, created around 1541, contains illustrations of these spaces, though Spanish censors later defaced the most graphic imagery. Stone platforms draped with jaguar pelts occupied the chamber centers. Braziers burned continuously, filling the air with smoke that mixed with hallucinogens coursing through women's bodies. Multiple women participated simultaneously during major ceremonies, sometimes a dozen or more in a single night. Named priest officials like the Mexicatl Teohuatzin organized these events with military efficiency. They scheduled which women would participate on which nights based on astrological calculations and the emperor's preferences. The hallucinogens served multiple purposes beyond religious justification. The substances made resistance difficult. A woman struggling against sacred mushroom effects couldn't fight back effectively or maintain clarity to refuse participation. The drugs created a dissociative state that palace physicians understood would help women psychologically, survive what was happening. Medical texts reveal that Aztec healers had sophisticated knowledge of how these substances affected consciousness. They used this knowledge deliberately, calculating doses that left women compliant during ceremonies but functional enough afterward to return to regular duties. What modern psychology calls chemical restraint, Aztec priests called sacred preparation. Now that you've witnessed how the selection system trapped these women, you're beginning to understand the machinery of power hidden behind religious ceremony. What comes next reveals how systematic this exploitation truly was. Ceremonies happening monthly, involving dozens of women, all justified as necessary for cosmic balance. If uncovering these buried truths about how ancient power really operated resonates with your curiosity about real history, subscribing ensures you never miss these deep dives into civilization's darkest corners. The rituals waiting ahead will challenge everything textbooks taught you about Aztec spirituality. The physical toll on women was documented by palace physicians whose records survived in fragments. Martín de la Cruz's Libellus de Medicinalibus Indorum Herbis, written in 1552, describes herbal treatments for internal injuries, tearing, and severe bruising. The text avoids explaining how these injuries occurred, focusing instead on remedies. Passiflora for pain, yarrow for bleeding. Specific herb combinations to prevent infection. That palace medical staff maintained extensive knowledge of these treatments reveals how common such injuries were. This wasn't emergency medicine for rare accidents. This was routine care for predictable damage. Pregnancy was inevitable. What happened when women conceived reveals even darker truths. Some pregnancies were celebrated if the emperor acknowledged paternity. These children had status, though inferior to offspring of official wives. But most pregnancies were complications to manage. Palace midwives administered abortifacient herbs, mixtures of kihuapatli and other plants that would induce miscarriage. Women who carried pregnancies to term gave birth in medical chambers. Their children's fates depended entirely on the emperor's acknowledgement. Without it, babies were given to servants or disappeared entirely from any record. One woman named Miahuaxochitl appears in documents from the 1530s. She testified before Spanish authorities about her palace years. She described giving birth to a daughter in 1518 and never seeing the child again after palace officials took the infant. She didn't know if her daughter lived or died. She never learned her name. 40 years later, her testimony still carried that pain. How many others experienced the same? The records don't say. Acknowledging these outcomes would have undermined the sacred mythology surrounding the system. The psychological control employed was perhaps more sophisticated than physical barriers. Religious belief was weaponized with precision. Women were told that serving the emperor was serving the gods themselves. Resistance wasn't just disobedience. It was cosmic treason that would result in divine punishment. The sun wouldn't rise. Crops would fail. The universe would collapse, and it would be their fault. This messaging began during training and continued daily through rituals, prayers, and constant reinforcement from priests and senior women. Most young women arrived already believing in the Aztec religious framework. Their families had raised them to honor the gods. The system twisted that genuine faith into chains stronger than any physical restraint. Women who resisted faced consequences designed to terrorize others. Some disappeared, their absence explained as reassignment or return to home cities. But former palace servants who testified after the conquest told different stories. They described punishment chambers in lower levels where resistant women were held in darkness, fed minimal food, subjected to treatment that broke their will. Those who emerged were changed, hollowed out, compliant in ways that frightened other women more than their initial resistance had. Others were made examples through public shaming, stripped of ceremonial clothing, and forced to perform degrading domestic tasks while others watched. The message was clear. Cooperation brought relative comfort. Resistance brought suffering that made cooperation look merciful. Fray Toribio de Benavente, Motolinea's History of the Indians of New Spain, written in 1541, contains accounts describing the ceremonial calendar's relentless nature. Every 20 days brought new rituals. Every solar event required ceremonies. The 18 Vientenas created a cycle that never stopped, never gave women time to recover physically or psychologically. The systematic nature makes this institutional rather than one deviant ruler's actions. Moctezuma didn't invent this system. He inherited it and expanded it. Archaeological evidence from Templo Mayor excavations begun in 1978 revealed architectural features that predated Moctezuma's reign. These spaces were designed for specific purposes generations before he took power in 1502. This was Aztec imperial practice, not individual pathology. The ceremonies were only one layer. What happened in Moctezuma's private quarters reveals where religious justification ended and personal appetite took over. The emperor's personal chambers occupied a separate section, removed from ceremonial spaces. Here, religious justification was unnecessary. Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés, in his letters from Mexico written between 1519 and 1526, described entering these spaces and finding accommodations for what guides estimated to be 150 women in regular rotation for the emperor's personal use. These 150 had one specific function: availability to Moctezuma whenever he desired, without waiting for ceremonial occasions. The nightly selection process followed a routine emphasizing absolute power. Senior women, eunuchs, and priests brought groups to an antechamber each evening. Moctezuma would observe them, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply gesturing to indicate his choice. Selected women were taken to prepare while others returned to wait. No woman could predict when she'd be chosen. The uncertainty was itself control, keeping every woman in anxious anticipation. Palace eunuchs managed the women's quarters. Castrated servants, usually captured warriors spared for this purpose, supervised private areas where concubines lived. They enforced rules, managed selection, and reported resistance or conspiracy. Bernal Diaz del Castillo described these men as fierce enforcers, perhaps precisely because their position depended entirely on maintaining order. Any failure meant their own punishment or death. The architectural design revealed sophisticated control mechanisms. Hidden passageways allowed eunuchs and guards to move unseen. Observation chambers with screened walls permitted surveillance of common areas. Every space was designed to prevent privacy, ensuring women could never gather in groups large enough to organize resistance. The anonymous conqueror, whose narrative from the 1520s provides detailed descriptions, wrote about discovering these features and recognizing them as prison design disguised as luxury. One of Moctezuma's daughters, Tequixpoch, later baptized Isabel Moctezuma, left testimony about palace life. Born around 1510, she lived through the conquest, eventually marrying multiple Spanish conquistadors through arrangements barely more consensual than her father's system. Her accounts describe daily life as endless competition for favor. Women who pleased the emperor received better accommodations, finer clothing, elevated status. Those who failed faced gradual demotion until they ended up in the lowest category. The competition prevented solidarity. Any friendship was tinged with rivalry. Any confidence might be reported to gain advantage. The system kept women isolated even when living in close proximity. Punishments ranged from temporary deprivation to permanent removal. Alonso de Zorita's brief and summary relation from the 1570s mentions palace officials who specialized in maintaining discipline. These enforcers administered beatings, imposed fasting, assigned degrading labor. More severe infractions led to expulsion from private quarters, sending women to lower categories where conditions were worse. The worst punishment meant transfer to temples where priests decided the woman's fate. Many never returned. The economic aspect reveals institutional nature. Women were exchanged as political gifts between Moctezuma and allied rulers. Subject cities sent beautiful daughters as diplomatic gestures to strengthen alliances. Receiving such a gift created obligation to favor that city in future disputes. The women were commodities in transactions between powerful men, their humanity irrelevant. Indigenous codices like the Codex Ixtlilxochitl contain references to these exchanges, depicting women presented alongside gold and feathers. Moctezuma fathered more than 100 documented children, possibly many more. Legitimate offspring of primary wives had clear status. Children born to concubines occupied ambiguous positions. Some received minor noble status. Others received no recognition whatsoever. For women who bore these children, motherhood brought no security unless the emperor specifically chose to elevate both mother and child, which rarely happened. A specific incident from early 1520, weeks before Spanish arrival, was documented by multiple sources. A major ceremony required dozens of women from private quarters. The scale was unusual, even by palace standards, suggesting Moctezuma sensed approaching chaos. Women who survived later described it as the most brutal event they'd experienced in years. The number requiring medical treatment overwhelmed palace physicians. Several died from injuries in the days that followed. This illustrates how the system could intensify beyond even its normal, horrific baseline. What Spanish witnesses described shocked even conquistadors. These were men who'd committed atrocities, enslaved populations, destroyed villages. Yet multiple accounts expressed genuine horror at what they found. That horror didn't prevent them from later establishing their own exploitative systems. But the documentation of their shock provides independent verification that the scale and systematic nature exceeded even other contemporary civilization standards. The enforcement wasn't just physical. It was psychological warfare designed to make resistance unthinkable. Palace guard structure included warriors specifically assigned to women's quarters. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were elite fighters chosen for loyalty to Moctezuma personally. Juan de Torquemada's Monarquia Indiana, published in 1615, describes a guard captain named only as Tlacaucalcatl, who commanded the forces securing the women's compounds. His name meant war chief, and he treated his assignment as military operation against potential enemies. The surveillance extended beyond visible guards. Women were enlisted to watch other women and report suspicious behavior. The most effective enforcers were women longest in the palace, who'd internalized the system's logic completely. They monitored conversations, noted close friendships, reported any talk of resistance. These informants received privileges, better food, private sleeping spaces, protection from worse demands. The palace hierarchy among women was itself an enforcement mechanism. Every woman could improve her situation by ensuring others remained beneath her. This prevented solidarity. Archaeological evidence revealed spaces in lower levels serving no apparent domestic or ceremonial function. Stone chambers with iron rings embedded in walls, rooms with drainage systems suggesting frequent washing, narrow cells barely large enough for a person to lie down. Post-conquest testimonies provided context. They were punishment chambers where resistant women were held for days or weeks. The physical conditions broke down health and will. The isolation destroyed mental stability. Francisco López de Gomara's Historia, General de las Indias from 1552, includes descriptions based on indigenous informants who'd served as palace guards. 3 documented escape attempts illustrate both the desperation and impossibility of success. In 1516, 2 women obtained guard uniforms and attempted to walk out disguised as male soldiers. They were discovered at the second checkpoint, dragged back, subjected to public punishment where others were forced to watch. In 1517, a woman hid in a waste cart leaving the complex. Guards routinely searched these carts. She was discovered and never seen again. In 1518, a woman named only as Maria tried to flee during a major festival when palace security was focused elsewhere. She made it to the causeway connecting Tenochtitlan to the mainland before guards caught her. Her punishment was designed as a lesson. She was brought back and subjected to public torture that stopped just short of death. Then she was assigned to the lowest category, performing the most degrading labor, forbidden from ever participating in ceremonies again. Escape attempts led to fates worse than compliance. Death would have been merciful. She became a living example. Other women saw her daily, a constant reminder that resistance brought only suffering. The complicity of other women reveals psychological complexity. Women who'd survived years became enforcers not because they believed, but because cooperation was the only survival strategy. A woman who reported another's resistance gained favor. A woman who helped break new arrival spirits secured her own position. The system deliberately created conditions where victimizing others became self-preservation. This internal enforcement was more effective than external guards because it came from people who understood intimately what every woman experienced. Then came 1520. The Spanish had arrived the previous year. Now, the situation deteriorated toward violence. Moctezuma was killed in May during the uprising, though sources disagree on whether Spanish or Aztec forces struck the fatal blow. The siege of Tenochtitlan that followed destroyed much of the city. For the women in the palace, liberation never came. Many died during the siege, trapped as fighting raged. Others were taken by Spanish soldiers who saw them as spoils of war, moving from Aztec captivity to Spanish enslavement without any moment of freedom. Bernal Diaz del Castillo's account of entering the palace describes a scene of devastation. Bodies of women who died still lay in courtyards. Survivors huddled in corners, traumatized beyond speech. The Spanish soldiers reacted with horror at the scale, but also eagerness to claim these women for themselves. The conquistadors' shock didn't prevent them from participating in the system's final chapter by distributing surviving women among themselves as slaves. Tecuichpoch was around 10 when the Spanish arrived. She was subsequently married to 3 different conquistadors in succession, unions arranged by Spanish authorities with no more regard for her consent than her father's system had shown. Her testimony in later years provides rare direct insight. She described the constant fear, the hierarchy, the impossibility of refusal, and the psychological toll of knowing her father saw her and other women as objects rather than people deserving dignity. Post-conquest fate for most women involved death during the siege, enslavement by conquistadors, or desperate attempts to return home where many families refused to accept them back. The Spanish colonial system dismantled the Aztec structure, but offered no liberation. Many former palace women ended up in Spanish encomiendas, working as servants or concubines. Others were forced into emerging colonial networks. A few found shelter in convents. Most simply disappeared from historical record, their fates unknown, their voices silenced. The silence about this history arose from multiple sources. Spanish chroniclers documented what they found, but often framed it as evidence of Aztec barbarism justifying conquest. Later historians had incentives to minimize or romanticize pre-conquest civilizations. The Aztec perspective, through indigenous codices, focused primarily on political and military history, leaving women's experiences undocumented. The result was a narrative that could discuss Aztec achievements without grappling with this institutional horror at its center. Modern archaeological discoveries beginning in the 1970s revealed physical evidence that corroborates the documentary record. Excavations identified the architectural features Spanish sources described. Analysis of remains confirmed the presence of young women who died from injuries consistent with documented accounts. These findings transformed scholarly understanding and verified that Spanish descriptions reflected a reality fundamentally accurate in its horror. You came into this story thinking Aztec civilization was about pyramids and calendars. And now you leave understanding the human cost of empire that textbooks erase. This transformation of perspective, seeing beyond monuments to the people crushed beneath them, is exactly why these hidden histories matter. The selection system, the ceremonies, the private quarters, the enforcement machinery. You now know what powerful institutions wanted buried. If having this insider knowledge of how power really operated in history empowers you to recognize similar patterns today, subscribing keeps you ahead of those who accept sanitized versions. Your time investment in learning these truths pays dividends in understanding how authority conceals exploitation behind beautiful facades. The acknowledgement of what you've witnessed matters because these women's suffering was real. Xochitl and thousands like her lived through experiences that destroyed their sense of self, their bodily autonomy, their capacity to trust human relationships. The system reduced them to objects in service of imperial power. Their humanity was denied by the very civilization we're taught to admire. The few survivors who left testimony did so decades later, finally able to speak about horrors they'd carried in silence through years of Spanish colonialism that offered its own forms of suffering. Modern understanding requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. Aztec civilization did create architectural marvels, sophisticated mathematics, complex religious philosophy. It also created and maintained an institutional system that trapped thousands of women across generations. Both truths are real. Neither cancels the other. But acknowledging the second transforms how we understand the first. Those magnificent pyramids were built by an empire that treated women as tribute goods. That sophisticated calendar tracked optimal times for ceremonies that traumatize participants. The complexity and brilliance makes the systematic cruelty more disturbing because it reveals that enlightenment in some domains can coexist with barbarity in others. The survivors received no justice. The Spanish didn't liberate them. They simply transferred them to a different system of colonial exploitation. The very few whose voices reached historical record spoke across vast distances of trauma and time. Most died without ever being heard. Their names aren't in the histories. Their suffering was erased, along with the empire that caused it. The 16-year-old girl from Tlatelolco, whose perspective opened this journey, had a name, a family, dreams of her own before tribute collectors selected her. What would she say if she could speak directly across 500 years? Perhaps she'd want you to know that she was a person, not a historical footnote, that she felt pain and fear, that she didn't want to be there, that the sacred language was lies that made powerful men feel righteous while committing systematic abuse, that she survived as long as she could and then she didn't, that her life mattered even though the empire saw her as disposable. That remembering what happened to her, and thousands like her, is the only justice possible now that all other forms have been foreclosed by the passage of centuries. Her lost voice echoes through the empty spaces where the palace complex once stood. The stones have been scattered, the chambers demolished, the system dismantled, but the memory remains, carried forward through documents written by conquerors, testimonies given by survivors, and archaeological evidence slowly revealing secrets buried in the earth. That memory is all we can offer now. Acknowledgement that this happened, that it was wrong, and that the women who suffered through it deserved better from history than to be erased from the story of the civilization that used them.